Hey everyone, this is Nick from the Botch Pit, and today we're going to be talking about World of Darkness Slasher, a sourcebook for the Chronicles of Darkness and Hunter the Vigil. Before we begin, I want to give a disclaimer in regards to how mature and grotesque this book can be at certain times. Unlike other books in the Chronicles of Darkness, the monsters housed within Slasher exist in our day-to-day lives. Slasher blends real-world fact into fiction and can make players extremely uneasy when implemented. For this broadcast, I'm going to do my best to acknowledge these elements and adult themes, however, I'm not going to dwell on them. The book itself even acknowledges some of these points of contention as well. Proceeding forward, I'm going to assume that you have an understanding of both the Chronicles of Darkness as well as Hunter the Vigil. If you potentially need a refresher on these titles, please check out the Botch Pit's guides to both of them before continuing. This is crucial in seeing how a slasher character actually evolves. I would also like to interject that even though World of Darkness Slasher is a sourcebook for these two, you will see me give examples of some other lines overlapping into it as well. So, what is a slasher in the World of Darkness? 2 words: killing machine. Lessons must be learned, mistakes must be corrected. Sometimes people kill, not out of poor judgment or even misguided revenge, but because they were driven to. Some are born that way, some are made, and even others are just programmed to. And it's never 1 or even 2 people. Oh no, that's way too easy. But it's a compulsion that can never be quenched. And on top of that, the kill may even have to be performed in a particular way. A certain organ must be taken in some sort of dark harvest. A cipher to be painted in blood above a ceiling. The kill having to be completed with a certain favorite weapon of theirs. Some target certain people. Liars, lustful teens, corrupt cops, beautiful people, pedophiles, perverts, prostitutes. Some also really don't care, and they'll kill anyone. Killing changes them, not necessarily turning something on, but turning it off. A light perhaps, part of one's soul, oneself. A place inside grows dark, into the shadow. Introducing the slasher. The apex predator, the perfect hunter. Part human, and quite frankly, part something else. In media, the slasher trope is a cornerstone of modern horror, beginning with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and typified today by the likes of Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. Needless to say, prior to listening to this broadcast, you've heard of the names of Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger in horror. In these films, we love the monster. We thrive on the innovative ways he ends lives, and how there exists a quiet moral message in his killings. We root for the slasher. I also want to mention the idea of in quotations, good slasher or serial killers to juxtapose this idea. These include anti-heroes where their victims can be seen as society's true monsters, killers, thieves, murderers, cheats, and so on and so forth. Dexter is a prime example of this, and one could even make the case that the Punisher exhibits some qualities of this as well. How about framing this within Hunter the Vigil as a slasher who kills only one type of monster, its underlings, its allies, and even its potential family? Those touched by this must also be cleansed in the eyes of a hunter. At this point in time, I would also like to revisit my hunter example of Ash Williams, specifically in Ash vs. Evil Dead. Ash has a knack for killing people, well, specifically people that have been turned into deadites. However, the everyday person doesn't really know this, and he's even earned the nickname Ashy Slashy in later episodes. In addition to the whole insane asylum treatment, he even gets a rhyme about how he goes about removing people. Ashy Slashy, hatchet and saw, takes your head and skins you raw. Ashy Slashy, heaven and hell, cuts out your tongue so you can't yell. We as the viewers don't really see Ash as this character that's this slasher type character, but he is. He is this person that other people can perceive as being a slasher. And that's one of the coolest parts about this book, is it actually tells you how to bring a hunter into a slasher. So, how is this done? How can a hunter become a slasher? Well, hunters are in many ways killers, even when they really try not to be. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary to put down a beast for the greater good. Most of these entities that these hunters hunt down were at one point human, and killing something that looks human and speaks can weigh on the mind. Some hunters find ways to look past it, while other souls are simply lost to it. They begin to justify their killings, as their integrity and morality begin to shudder and fragment. Others may even start to enjoy it. Given this potential history, slashers can also use the same tactics employed by hunters, such as group tactics. And a group of slashers is indefinitely more deadly than a group of hunters. Another point to kind of consider is, would a group of hunters want to work with a slasher, this more supernatural human that's an absolute killing machine? And my retort to this is, what if they didn't know it yet? What if one person in the group actually turned into a slasher and created almost like the Thing type of mentality within the group? And speaking within Hunter specifically, this not only creates extremely powerful antagonists, but it also allows players a way of descending down into the shadow from their once light. And becoming a slasher could potentially happen to any hunter. The longer you stare into the abyss, the longer that abyss stares back at you. The longer that you are pursuing the Vigil, the easier it will be to become a slasher. I also want to make a note at this time that we are taking a human and we're turning them into a slasher, which is already this super powerful killing machine. However, you can also apply this template to other monsters as well. For example, we mentioned Freddy Krueger earlier in this broadcast. Freddy Krueger is a monster that I would consider within the world of darkness being a beast that has gone slasher, which is this whole otherworldly entity that supersedes anything that our slashers could potentially become. So when you make a slasher, make sure you keep it within the power level that your players can potentially have the ability to take down if you so choose. This is just something to really consider when crafting the slasher. However, for the sake of simplicity at this moment, we're going to look at how you would make a normal mortal or human, whether it's a hunter or otherwise, into a slasher. So the first requirement that this individual needs in order to become a slasher is that there needs to be some sort of catalyst that has changed them into it. Whether that's getting their first taste of blood, whether there's some mental influence of some kind. Something needs to exist that actually made this person into a killer. Now, in order to qualify to be a slasher, the character must have a morality or integrity from 0 to 4. 5 and above are considered ineligible at this time. However, when that starts to drop and they hit between these limits, they are eligible to becoming slashers. Another rule regarding morality and integrity with slashers is that they can no longer drop it to gain additional points to be allocated elsewhere, unlike some other characters when they initially go into character creation. When building the perfect killer with hunter characters, professions need to be adjusted from that hunter template to fit the new slasher template and everything that kind of brings along with it. When they put down the Vigil in favor of what's called the Slaughter, they lose some of the additional benefits that hunters could have. However, that's not always the case. Really, you need to consult with your storyteller on what you're able to keep and what you should actually change. The final and most creative aspect about creating a slasher character is the application of what's called an undertaking. And an undertaking is seen almost like a classification of killer, and it's more of a game term than an in-game term. Like, you never hear any hunter organizations or anyone else referring to them as undertakings. Each undertaking has 2 levels. The first is called the Ripper, while the latter is called the Scourge. When analyzing these two, you really should look at it as though it's an evolutionary line. So, in our example, it would go from human to hunter, hunter to Ripper, and eventually Ripper to Scourge. Although, I also would like to point out that not all Rippers will eventually become Scourges. We're about to go into this a little deeper. However, at this point in time, in terms of a broad overview, I want you to consider that the Scourge is the supernatural version of the Ripper undertaking. Each variant of slasher, whether it is Ripper or Scourge, has both talents as well as frailties, which are advantages and disadvantages. Talents for Rippers are abnormal, eerie, even awe-inspiring, but they aren't magical. Likewise, their frailties are just logical extensions of their madness and shortcomings. However, Scourges are much harder to kill because their talents propel them into that realm of supernatural creatures. However, their frailties give them weaknesses that can allow enemies to kill them or even drive them off. So it's not always that they're going to be completely protected. And also something to remember is that when a Ripper ascends to a Scourge, that they bring along all their talents and frailties from their Ripper stage as well. And honestly, the way that Rippers ascend to Scourges really comes with time. The longer that these people are out doing what they are doing, the more experience they'll get and the more they'll ascend up. The undertaking also somewhat defines the stats for the Scourge and Ripper as well. For example, undertaking defines the attribute that you boost to 4 or 5 dots during character creation. This boost is free. Instead of starting with 1 dot of the relative attribute, you start with 4 for Rippers or 5 for Scourges. If you wish a Ripper to have a rating of 5 in the attribute, you must spend 2 of your attribute dots allocated to that category. Undertakings also dictate which skills the character uses to commit their crimes. The player chooses 2 undertaking skills from the list provided in the undertaking write-ups. The skill chosen must have a rating of at least 2, and at least one of these characters' 3 specialties must be placed in one of these skills. Going forward, I want to talk about each Ripper and Scourge pair together, and I want to provide some examples of each. When I give the example, I'm giving more of the Scourge level, and you would just have to dial it back to understand what the Ripper level would be. Personally, this is what I really enjoy about this book, is this given section, because it does an incredible job about providing you all the information you need to create these characters. So the first set is the Avenger and the Legend. And when you think of this set, the character that I want you to think about is actually Batman. How this particular set of characters hunts one type of enemy. In the case of Batman, it would be criminals, and would kind of cause a boogeyman vibe to those given types of people. Avengers have the talent working the room, which means that they can typically strike first and attack multiple enemies at once. However, their frailty is nothing but the mission, which means nothing can stop them in completing what they need to get done. My fun fact for this session is that the term Avengers, the name for this, is actually taken from one of the 9 creeds in Hunter the Reckoning. With the Scourge level of this, Legend, it all comes back to this boogeyman aspect. The legend that has been created around this character is so strong, it affects them. For example, their talent is to get strength from the tales from other people talking about the myths of this character. However, their frailty is they're trapped in this story, that all legends have a weakness, and this weakness is up to the player to decide, but exploiting this weakness will inflict aggravated damage or ignore armor and defense. This would also be the level that our Freddy Krueger beast slasher hybrid would be at. The next set is the Brute and the Mask, and this is where you get your Mike Myers or Jason Voorhees into the world of darkness from. The Brute is a simple person with a one-track mind, and that really shows through his evolution into the Mask. His talent is unstoppable, and they're hard to kill. And what's really cool about this is depending on what your role is, your Brute can be rendered unconscious but still be able to get up to do one last attack. Their frailty is that they're blinded by blood, and their hyper-focus on murder gives the Brutes the strength they need, but it doesn't perceive the world around them very clearly. Now Masks, the Scourge counterparts of the Brutes, are incredibly powerful and are, in my opinion, some of the most powerful beings in the world of darkness. That is because their talent is unstoppable killing machine, where they perform the same aspects as the Brutes. However, every attack done on a Mask, no matter how powerful it is, only gives the Mask 1 point of damage. This includes supernatural attacks done by characters such as mages. Incidental damage, however, like falling, electrocution, drowning in fire, inflicts its usual damage, but you can see how heavy this can be broken. Their frailty is that they have no mind but for murder, as in they can't speak, write, or generate language in any meaningful way. I mean, they can nod their heads and move and wave in a certain direction, but complicated gestures are beyond them. The next set is the Ripper Charmer and the Scourge Psycho. And for an example of this is where you get the Joker. This is the character element in all of World of Darkness that relates to that type of character. Charmers don't really see people as people, they see them as objects. And as such, they toy with them and they rip from them, all on this thin veneer that they're actually really good people on the outside. And for them, it's all fun and games until the bodies start appearing. Charmers are ready to pull up stakes at any moment, but they prefer to keep their charade going on as long as possible. The goal for a charmer isn't necessarily to kill. The goal of the charmer is knowing that their victims trusted them before they took them out. So the talent of the charmer is that they are incredibly disarming, which means that players or the charmer themselves has to roll different presence and social skills in order to avoid being found out. And what's really cool about that is if the charmer wins, the player or the charmer makes excuses on behalf of the charmer of why he's the way he is, or she. Their frailty, however, is that they have a very thin veneer, and they are very held together with just, as it says in the book, a few staples and a few strands of sinew. Anything that could happen that would fragment their world would be the worst thing for these types of people. The Psycho, the Scourge counterpart, is a much bigger and badder version of this previous character. They are unlike Charmers in that they are not physically weak, where a Charmer is almost unassumingly physically weak. These people are not. Whereas the Charmer really thrives in the violation of trust, the Psycho is the true slasher and is interested in filling their needs through complete violence. Deadly Distraction is the talent of the Psycho, which causes someone to drop their guard just long enough for the Psycho to incapacitate or kill them. The frailty of the Psychos is that they are incredibly obsessive and they can't just let someone go. Once they've been either in the Deadly Distraction talent that they've had before or just in social roles, the Psycho seeks them out and won't stop until they're hunted down. The next set of Ripper and Scourge is the Freak and the Mutant, and what you can really think of these people as is the clan from The Hills Have Eyes. A Freak is very similar to a Brute, as in they are very indomitable characters. However, the key differences between both of them is that the Freak usually suffers from some sort of deformity. And as such, what's really cool about playing a Freak is that they can use a lot of body modifications, such as sharpened teeth, elongated hands, and other really cool aspects that you can't really get with any of these other types of characters. Also to note, in the book, they state that these characters are also the ones that are more likely to resort to cannibalism. So if that's something that you want to approach in your games in some sort of way, this is the key character to doing that. The talent that the Freak has is Lay of the Land, which basically means that they have direction sense instantly, and when they're on their own turf, they know it the best, and that they suffer no penalties depending on, say, if it's slick or if it's raining outside. They know that land the best. However, their frailty is that deformity, and they apply a -4 penalty to all social rolls. The mutant is the scourge of the Freak, and it's just a bigger, badder mess than the Freak, where it's stated that there's not really any human-looking features to this individual. And they've also talked about how, within this book, that for this type of character, the first murder that they actually committed could have potentially been accidental. They could have been giving someone that they really like a hug and accidentally hugged too tight and that person died. So it kind of gives a more human element than the rest of these other creatures, these other slashers. However, it's the one that's most far removed from humanity, which is kind of cool to look at. Or I should say, the furthest removed from what a human would look like is actually the truest one to what a human should act like. So the talent of the mutant is that natural weaponry that we kind of referenced with the Freak, but the deformities of the mutant actually work in favor for them when it comes to murder. They can have, sharp fangs, sharp claws, or they could actually take natural armor. The frailty of mutants are that they are actually incredibly sensitive, so they automatically fail social roles against anyone who's actually seen their face, but in addition to that, they're also sensitive to elements such as incredibly bright light. So the last pair of undertakings that we have is the Genius and the Maniac, and for these types of characters, I want you to really think about Hannibal Lecter. And that's kind of the quintessential one, besides maybe perhaps Jigsaw, that kind of fits within this realm. So the geniuses, what they are people who think that they know more than anyone else, who kind of have that air about them that if I set this trap, you're going to fall directly into it. And that's kind of the defining attribute for the genius. Their talent is profiling, which means that they can probably predict what a given person will do in the basic way based on just their appearance, body language, and their bearing. Their frailty is intolerance for chaos, which is if they have a variable that they didn't encounter for and that goes awry, that drives them absolutely insane. Maniacs are a lot more dangerous than their ripper counterparts, geniuses, and that's because their ideologies are almost infectious to the point where they have underlings with them that actually make the same stuff they would do as a genius look like child's play. They are able to brainwash these individuals and actually have events happen and trigger that make it look like everything was an accident. Cult leaders will work really well with this type of character. Maniacs have the telling, compelling madness, which not only allows them to profile an individual within minutes of meeting them and know everything about them, but they have, with given time, been able to alter a victim's morality. For their frailty, they have obvious lunatic, which means that maniacs are dangerous and is obvious to anyone who talks to them. They are able to give instructions or convey a message, but beyond that time, people around them feel threatened. So now that we know how the perfect killer is built, what I kind of wanted to talk about for a moment was the merits and tactics that slashers use. When it comes to the application of this book, where I get the most value from it is actually in its merits. Personally, I felt that some of the standard Hunter the Vigil merits felt very lackluster compared to the ones presented in this book, so my initial delving into this book was due to its merits for Hunter characters. And what's very awesome to see when approaching this book, if you know those merits, are the overlap that exists between both books. For example, my favorite one to kind of consider is the favored weapon merit from Hunter, where a hunter has a particular weapon that makes them feel safe. Whereas in Slasher, they have the weapon Monomaniac perk, which adds a little bit of extra flavor to these previous merits that wasn't really available before. It's also really cool because these merits kind of show a derivation from hunter to slasher, depending on the willingness of your storyteller and your integrity level. This might be something to consider with some of your hunter characters as they begin to lose more and more morality or integrity. This perception also carries over into tactics as well, because I feel the tactics presented in slasher are just that little bit more brutal, where it makes it a little bit more enjoyable to a certain extent. One of my favorite names for a tactic ever created is beatdown, good old fashioned, which is employed by slashers but also other hunters in order to just absolutely pummel an enemy. It's these little bits of flavor that add a lot more character to a story than just the standard hunter, the vigil tactics, is what I'm trying to get out of this. When it comes to the weapons used by slashers, you have your standard chainsaws, the razor wire, machetes, all that cool stuff. But this book also allows you to think about approaching scenarios in different ways with certain mundane objects. For myself, it was one of those first books that kind of illuminated or maybe look at different creative ways about taking out enemies. Not necessarily in this case humans, but just supernatural creatures in general. It's also fun because you can also keep storytellers on their toes if they don't know 100% of the stuff you could potentially do with a human using some slasher elements. For example, one of my favorite things that they actually brought in this book was a body modification called Concealed Pouch, which basically means that the slasher can actually hide items within their own body by putting it within this pouch that's like with underneath their skin, which is the most goriest, brutalist way of actually going about this. But it's something interesting because what happens if they put a skeleton key in there? You don't really know where to go with that, and as a storyteller, that's kind of interesting that someone would have thought that far to implant a key in their own skin. Other weapons include power tools such as drills, as well as homemade traps and weaponry. So who could be seen as some of the antagonists of an antagonist such as slasher? In this book, they actually list a new third-tier conspiracy called VASCU, which stands for the Vanguard Serial Crimes Unit, who are a government organization that deal directly with slashers. And it's awesome to see how they brought in other hunter organizations and their relationship to slashers in general, because technically a lot of other organizations wouldn't necessarily see slashers as supernatural. And it's awesome to see, even with the relation of Task Force Valkyrie, another government-run secret organization, they kind of stomp all over VASCU. And they always show the dynamic between both of them throughout the entire book, which is really awesome to see. And VASCU also uses terminology such as serial killers, spree killers, mass murderers, and slashers to define just how far removed these people are, and kind of show another level of depth and another level of understanding of how to actually approach playing a character underneath VASCU. The book also discusses the Lansing facility where they actually hold and study slashers, field operations underneath VASCU, such as liaisons and even suicide squads. It's some pretty awesome stuff. And overall, from a more broader picture, they also kind of illuminate how each tier, we talked about before, tier 1, just regular cells, tier 2, which are compacts, and tier 3, which are other conspiracies, and how each one of them approaches the slasher phenomenon. However, when running a slasher game, or a hunter game that incorporates slashers in some way, who is really the big bad of slashers? Who are the enemies that a slasher would probably fear the most? And I would like to offer the potential of incorporating a book called Geist the Sin Eaters into your slasher arsenal. The reasoning behind this is a Geist communicates with ghosts, and it's kind of the manifestation of all these ghosts that approach it with all these problems. It can see them. And what happens to the slasher's victims? And that's just a whole other level of thinking when you approach this game, that the victims of this slasher would probably surround itself in a given area, and Geists are attracted to all this massive manifestation of death. And what would happen if a slasher stays in a certain area for a certain amount of time and the dead just keep piling up and piling up and piling up? It's going to attract eventually a geist. And how would a geist want to approach someone who just willingly goes out and does the stuff for pretty much fun? And that's just a kind of cool concept to kind of use when approaching slashers. Even though slashers are big bads, and even we saw with masks, they can be incredibly powerful. You're fighting a geist and a sin eater, and you know what? That's really, really cool. To wrap this up, I want to talk about my experience with slasher in relation to the Botch Pit. Although we've never seen an explicit slasher character appear in any of our Chronicle games so far, we have used slasher in some way, shape, or form across a multitude of different characters. The prime example is one of the hunters, Valerie Fox, in relation to how slippery of a slope it is to exist within this world of darkness as soon as you take up the mantle of being a hunter. It is to illustrate the dark side, the shadow that exists. Hunters are represented by light, these soul entities that actually go up and fight against the darkness, whereas what a slasher is that light extinguished and consumed by shadow that that individual has become. And sometimes that individual or even your party members don't know how far you've gotten until you begin to illustrate it. And that's where in the Botch Pit where we found our core elements in slasher. In addition to this, the engineer, one of the primary antagonists of the Botch Pit's Chronicle, was originally conceptualized as being a hybrid between slasher and the God Machine Chronicle, indicating that this template can be applied to a whole host of different game lines. It has been stated in the second edition of Hunter the Vigil that this sourcebook has been included with it, which is really exciting to see, and it allows more people to actually be able to implement this fall from grace to some of their characters. And as a parting thought, slasher exists as the point of no return. Once you turn your hunter into a slasher, things will change. So before doing that, you need to really consider both with yourself and your storyteller if this is an avenue that you'd really like to pursue. This has been Nick from the Botch Pit. Thank you.